y'all, it's your girl Toyzilla with another episode of Toyzilla Streams Book Club. Alright, we're continuing on with the second book in the Looking Glass Wars series, Seeing Red by Frank Better. Now, if y'all haven't read any of the previous chapters before, just go ahead and look on the YouTube channel, search Toyzilla, and look for that bear bot symbol. Y'all see it like right up there. Yep, right next to my name. Today we will be reading chapters 16 and 17. And if while you're reading along you decide, the spirits of creativity has hit you and you want to draw something and send it into our Discord channel, I'll be happy to see it and showcase it. Just because, I like art. I like the reading. And, with all these books that don't got a lot of pictures, this adds a little something to the mix. But without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump in to see what happens next. Woof. Woof. Chapter 16. Montmartre, Paris, June 1873. The painter awoke from a fitful sleep, his nightmares cut short by the cries of his newborn son, who seemed to be suffering unquiet dreams of his own. Outside, rain thrashed the streets and lightning split the sky. The painter's wife complainingly went to check on the baby, and the painter himself stared out the window as a few pedestrians, making their way through the downpour, with their shoulders hunched and their heads bowed, they looked to his trained eye. Furtive and morose, people bent on illicit errands. "What are you walking yet?" His wife was standing at the door of their room with the whimpering baby in her arms. If he'd had any doubt before, he had none now. Her mood was as foul as the weather. What did he propose to do about the landscape he'd been commissioned to paint with the storm raging the way it was? She wanted to know. How was she supposed to pay for the milk and butter they needed? No wonder the child was bawling all the time with such a useless thing of a father. To get away from her, the painter locked himself in a studio, where he sat sulking and blinking at his blank canvas. But after what felt like an endless morning, the weather broke. The sky was overcast, the sodden streets blanched by a flat pallid light. It will have to do. He packed up his box of paints and brushes and, with a folded easel under his arm, escaped into the streets. The gutters were choked with mud and litter. The rumble of carriages attacked his ears like the roaring of giant beasts, and the faces of those he passed, peering out sullenly from behind lowered hat brims and upturned collars, seemed marred by unfriendliness, if not outright hostility. In the Jardin des Tuileries, he placed his easel next to an oval pond, with a view across its surface to a stand of chestnut trees. Normally a quick painter who finished canvases in a matter of hours, this one gave him trouble for some reason. He tried to empty his mind, to find the morning's fret and lose himself in the ecstasy of creation. But when he put away his brushes at the end of the afternoon, his canvas boasted little more than the clouds of color that compromised his background tones in the middle of which he was surprised to see daubs of black paint. "Let's have a look at what you've done," his wife commanded when he returned to the apartment. She reached for the canvas. Her lips pursed in perplexity. Her brow collapsed. The baby, whom she held absently in one arm, began to cry. "What are those?" She pointed to the spots of black paint. "I will correct them tomorrow," he said. "You'd better, or you won't get paid, and then where will we be?" The next day's painting went much like the first. He struggled to tap the vein of inspiration, to let himself become hypnotized by the wonder of nature, the rhythmic dipping of his brush in oils and the feel of its bristles on canvas. When he packed up his supplies in the late afternoon, he was stunned to see, amid the rough contours of pond and trees he had produced with hours of effort, that not only were the daubs of black paint still there, they were larger and more detailed. Not daubs at all, but the crunched beginnings of human figures walking over the pond's surface toward him. Nor were they strictly black in color. One of the figures had taken on a decisively reddish hue. He covered the painting with his jacket to avoid looking at it and, full of a foreboding he couldn't explain, started the walk home, passing squalid brasseries and dingy apartment houses he had never noticed before. His usual route was blocked off, clogged with onlookers of some police activity, the crowd so greedy for a glimpse of others' misfortune that he became frightened and turned off into the nearest lane. He took an unfamiliar course home and was hiding in his studio when his wife burst in. "I want to see it," she said. "I don't, it's not," he stammered. She noticed his jacket hanging over the easel. "Is that it?" "No." She stepped to the easel before he could stop her, yanked the jacket off, and... "You said you were going to fix them!" she protested when she saw the strange figures. "Do you want your son to starve? Are you trying to kill us through hardship?" After 3 full days from the Tuileries, there was hardly any landscape to speak of. The pond, the chestnut trees, the painter had buried all beneath streaks and daubs of paint that formed the two figures who had so hijacked his imagination. The palette he had used to render them was more primary than usual, consisting of heavy reds, blacks, and browns, but, as in all his paintings, the hard lines of the figures were blurred to suggest the constant movement of things. One of the figures wasn't human, but a broad-chested creature with over-muscled arms and legs, and, where its hands should have been, thick paws with claws as glittering and long as polished carving knives. What's more, it had the face of a cat, complete with whiskers and a menacing set of fangs. The other figure was probably a woman, though nothing about the thick bramble of red hair, the sniffle face with its wrinkles of disgust and eyes stilled with condensation suggested femininity. No, it was the contour that made the painter think the figure was a woman. A dress made entirely of thorny roses and their long twisting vines. The blooms on several of the roses faced him, their innermost petals bearing teeth like eager mouths hungry for a bite of. He didn't like to guess. In his studio, hiding from his wife, he threw the painting on the fire. The haunting figures were gone, cinders and ash. Burning them had been for the best. But by noon the following day, among the background tones that had been all he'd managed to set on canvas, were 2 black splotches of paint he didn't remember making. He painted over them immediately. Paint a landscape. Any landscape. But they were already back by the time he was packing up to go home. The humanoid feline and the cruel woman in her dress of roses taking up his entire canvas. His next attempt turned out exactly like the others, as did the one after that. He could paint nothing but the cat beast and the snarling woman. Bitter and depressed, he welcomed his wife's scoldings. He deserved them. He was a failure. He carried his failings to a nameless alley. He entered a nameless establishment where neither beauty nor virtue were to be found, just cheap wine, which he slung down his throat until he could see nothing clearly, until everything inside and outside his head was a tilting carousel, spinning around in a blur of colors and textures. He had to dull his senses, had to keep himself from envisioning the cat beast and its female companion. Somehow, in the early dawn, and despite lampposts frequently darting into his path, he made it back to his apartment. In the unlit studio, he couldn't see his latest attempt at a landscape, but he sensed it. A large canvas, as tall as himself, covered with a bedsheet and leaning against a wall in the corner. "What's that?" he said aloud, because he thought he'd heard. Was that sheet rustling? Did he hear breathing? Purring? Knock! He gasped awake, still in his suit. He lit the lamp and gazed around, trying to focus his thoughts to understand what had. My God. The studio door was in splinters. The sheet that had been covering his painting lay on the floor. He started to lift his glance. He didn't want to look. He was afraid. But he had to. Slowly, he raised his eyes to what was left on the canvas, too horrified to cry out at what he saw. Where the cat, beast, and woman had been there was nothing, just a hole exactly the shape of their outlines, as if someone had cut them out of the picture or... Impossible, the painter breathed. Because things like that didn't happen. A pair of painted figures escaping their canvas? It was a joke. Inanimate figures did not come to life as in some fairy tale. It was one thing for his paintings to suggest vitality and life, but to have actually created them with nothing more than brushes and oils? It's impossible. Impossible. He kept repeating. But if it was impossible, why did he have a dream fuzz memory of the ferocious woman and cat beast standing over him as he curled in his cot, sleeping off his drunk? A memory in which he was both participant and observer. The only reason I don't kill him, he remembered the woman saying, her voice sounding like the scrape of iron against iron, a corrosion of vocal cords, is because he's not important enough. Chapter 17. Molly's head felt like it had been cracked open and poorly fit back together. Her shoulders ached. Her forearms tingled raw as a skinned. Her swollen hands were so sensitive that it hurt to make a fist. It hurt to do most things, including blink. So she lay with her eyes closed, remembering what had happened. The Lady of Diamonds, the carved wooden chest that was supposed to have gone to Queen Alice. Her suspicion of a plot to upset Alice's reign, which, judging by her present pains, had not been ill-placed. But an attempt on the Queen's life? The Lady of Diamonds was bolder than she had supposed. Alice had to be informed. Molly forced herself to sit up and open her eyes. What the? King Arch was sitting in a chair next to her mattress. What was Arch doing in Wonderland? She lives, he said. A minister scurried in on silent feet and whispered in the king's ear, which was when she realized Arch wasn't in Wonderland. She was in Borderland. But how had she ended up in Borderland? Where was her gear? And what was she wearing that encased her like a second skin? Instead of her usual pants and belt, she had on a form-fitting one-piece made of some unfamiliar pink material, and there were no visible buttons or clasps by which to remove it. The collar fit tightly about her neck, the leggings tightly around her ankles, and the cuffs of the long sleeves came close to choking off the blood supply to her hands. She hated tight-fitting clothing. She hated tight-fitting clothes. Worse, she hated pink. Send her in with the dumplings, Arch told the minister, who left as quietly as a curl of smoke. The king smiled down at Molly. And how are we feeling after our much-needed nap? Where are my things? Right there. He pointed to a table across the room, on which her Homburg millinery coat, backpack, belt, and wrist blades were neatly arrayed. Standing on either side of the table were two creatures from a species she had never seen before. You underestimate me, she said, and lunged for her gear. Her legs gave way as if they'd been shorn of all muscle. Her arms were useless, and she was unable to steady her vision, as if her eyes were swirling in their sockets independently of each other. She fell to the floor, far, far away, she felt someone pick her up and set her back down. Her head began to settle and she found herself on the mattress. "It seems, Molly, it is you who underestimates me," Arch said. "I should have perhaps told you the item you're wearing is a drug delivery system. When you make any sudden move, it will secrete through your skin a certain something that, well, I hope you'll never succumb to the illusionary charms of artificial crystal. But let's just say that this certain something produces an effect similar to a night of overindulgence with such unhealthy ingestives." "What do you want with me?" she asked. "You had an unpleasant tumble." He nodded toward the unfamiliar creatures. "My Ganymede friends and I are nursing you back to health, that's all." "By drugging me?" Molly tried to intimidate him with her most vicious glare, but not getting much of a response, she fell to pulling at her collar and the cuffs at her wrists. "You might as well try to remove your own skin," Arch said. "Please understand, Molly, I have no intention of harming you. The Lady of Diamonds has caused you enough inconvenience, I think. Your flattering outfit is simply a precaution in case you overreact at finding yourself here. I hope that soon you'll choose to stay here as my personal guest." Molly rose to her feet, slowly, steadily. "I have a duty to my queen, who will be missing me. I would like to go home now." "I wouldn't be so hasty. The queen you left might not be the one you return to." He was trying to trick her into something. She would be smart. She would keep her mouth shut, learn as much as possible, and report back to Alice. "I want you to know that I find it appalling how the Lady of Diamonds attempted to deceive you," the king said. "You are to be commended for protecting the queen from opening the Lady of Diamonds' gift. However much your doing so has jeopardized the queen himself." Seeing Molly's questioning expression, he explained. "Yes, it seems your little adventure in the Crystal Continuum has limited the mobility of Queen Alice's army, a circumstance the Diamond Clan has taken advantage of to try and gain the crown." Molly didn't believe him, refused to believe him. Besides, the Lady of Diamonds could never defeat Alice Hart. Arch rose from his chair and paced about the tent. "The Diamonds came to me for support. But as you can see, my loyalty lies with Queen Alice rather than with a scheming lady of rank in her queendom." He was at the table, picking over her wrist blades and coat and backpack as if they were a merchant's untidy wares. "I should never have been so dismissive of you when we first met at Hart Palace. I should have realized that you possess formidable skills, since it's not anyone who can take Hatter Madigan's place." Molly said nothing. "Your parents must be extremely proud of you." He turned abruptly to face her. "Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot that you don't have parents. King or not, he was lucky she didn't have access to her Humberg." Arch sat back down in his chair and, with practiced nonchalance, asked, "Do you know how much? Do you know much about the people who brought you into this world?" "I know enough." "Really? Is that why you don't seem very curious about them?" "There's nothing to be curious about," she said. "Nothing to be? But don't you want to know why they gave you up?" "They didn't give me up." She flung herself at him, but her legs refused to obey her. Her arms belonged to somebody else, and her head filled with kaleidoscopic jelly. When her wits were again hers, she was back on the mattress. "I apologize," Arch said. "I should have taken into account how the trials of life can break a family apart for reasons that have nothing to do with ill will or a lack of love in any of its members. With Red in control of Wonderland as she was, the actions of your parents might have only appeared uncaring when in fact they were just the opposite, necessary to your survival. Uh-huh, Molly said, hating him. Do you, by chance, remember how old you were when you last saw your mother? She wasn't going to answer. She would tell this man nothing, especially not that she'd been just 3 lunar years old when Weaver left the Allison camp in the everlasting forest, and that, if not for the holographic crystal of her mother posing in front of the Unnatural History Museum shortly before Red's coup, she wouldn't even know what the woman looked like. Her name was Weaver, wasn't it? Molly was startled. How'd you know that? He waved off the question. I've hardly begun to astound you, Molly. Not only do I know your mother's name, I know who your father is. And what's more, so do you. You've already met him. Molly was so taken aback by all of this that she didn't hear Arch call for his bodyguards. Shadows fell over her as Ripkins and Blistered into the tent. Molly wants to know her father's name, Arch said to them. Why don't we give her a hint? His first name rhymes with splatter, said Ripkins. And matter, put in Blister. Also fatter, said Ripkins. Likewise, chatter, added Blister. And his surname, Arch asked. It rhymes with that again, said Ripkins. And Flanagan, put in Blister. Also, Patafin, offered Ripkins. Or Panatin. Arch and Blister looked at him. Panikin, he said proudly. Shut up, shut up, shut up, Molly screamed. You don't know what you're talking about. Perhaps not, Arch said. But I can think of at least one person whose knowledge you'll trust. He got to his feet as a strange aroma wafted into the tent. Here she comes now with a plate of dodo dumplings, one of my favorite Borderland delicacies, to help you regain your strength. Ready to deny all, to denounce Borderland as a nation of liars, Molly turned and saw the last person in the world she had ever expected to see alive. Mom? And that's the end of chapter 17. Oh my goodness. I just adore this book so much. She just found out who her mom and her dad is. Oh my gosh. I can't wait to see what happens next. Now remember, this has been Toyzilla with Toyzilla Streams Book Club. If y'all made some artwork and want to send it into the Discord channel in the Creativezilla Corner. I'll be looking forward to it. Until next time, y'all. We are ending soon. Toyzilla is out. Goodbye, everybody.